Hi, I'm Brandon Neely from the Civil War Institute, and I'm here at the Wilson's Creek battlefield in southwest Missouri. This video will be the first in a short series about this 1861 Missouri battle and about some of the ways that the Civil War affected people in border states like this. Today, I'm at the Edwards Cabin and at the site of General Price's headquarters, a perfect location to discuss ideas of loyalty during the Civil War. The house behind me looks different than it would have on the day of the battle. The cabin, which originally stood in this location, was built in 1856 by William Edwards, a Missouri farmer and Union sympathizer. In the field around the cabin, rebel soldiers camped the night before the battle. During breakfast, as the rebel leaders met, a messenger arrived, carrying word that the Union troops had attacked the northern end. Battle had arrived at Wilson's Creek, and it was in a breakfast tent just outside of Edwards' cabin that the rebel army had to plan their response. In the battle that followed, around 17,000 soldiers fought each other at places like Bloody Hill, Sharp's Farm, and the Ray Cornfield. Not all of these soldiers had arrived in their respective organizations for the same reasons, though, and in many places, questions of loyalty had tragic consequences. The battle and the events leading up to it highlight some of the challenges with allegiance in border states during the war. Let's use the events at Wilson's Creek as a way to look at different allegiances in Missouri and how those allegiances helped to shape the Civil War in border states. In the decades leading up to the Civil War, Missouri was a center of debates around slavery. As a result of many of these debates, fierce regional and ideological loyalties were formed. It begins with the Missouri Compromise in 1820. At the time, there was an equal number of free and slave states in the U.S. Missouri, which would enter as a slave state, would upset the balance of power in the federal government. To compromise, Congressman Henry Clay proposed that Missouri would enter as a slave state, while Maine would enter as a free state. This proposal succeeded, and Missouri entered the Union as a slave state on August 10, 1821, exactly 40 years before the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Debates around slavery continued during the Bloody Kansas Crisis, when similar arguments about the admission of Kansas to the Union caused widespread violence on the Kansas-Missouri border. For the most part, Missourians who joined the violence, known as border ruffians, fought for Kansas to become a slave state, although some groups joined with anti-slavery forces. Anti-slavery Kansans, who took on the pro-slavery Missouri border ruffians, were known as Jayhawks. As a result, many Jayhawks developed fierce rivalries with pro-slavery Missourians. Ultimately, Kansas was admitted as a free state in 1861, just before the outbreak of the war. The loyalties that were caused by the issue of slavery in Bloody Kansas carried over into the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Many men fought in the Bloody Kansas conflict before fighting again here. One such man was Samuel Walker, an anti-slavery Kansan who raised the first military company in Kansas to fight Missouri border ruffians. After being involved in Bloody Kansas, Walker would go on to lead the 1st Kansas Volunteer Regiment against rebel troops here at Wilson's Creek. The loyalties established during Bloody Kansas led to many Jayhawks joining the Union Army, while pro-slavery border ruffians joined guerrilla groups across Missouri, Arkansas, and Kentucky. However, slavery was not the only issue that determined loyalty in border states like Missouri. For example, St. Louis had a massive German immigrant population who were fiercely loyal to the Union itself. While many of these citizens were also abolitionists, opposition to secession itself was a motivator for Union support. One of the most famous German-American veterans was Franz Sigel, who would lead Union forces here at Wilson's Creek before going on to attain the rank of Major General. In border states, many immigrant groups or citizens in larger cities supported both the Union and abolition. Similarly minded citizens in other regions of Missouri also joined Home Guard groups. These groups were armed and funded by the Union Army, but weren't considered official parts of the military. Instead, they were organized for pro-Union citizens to protect themselves against secessionist violence in their communities. Many Missouri Home Guardsmen would fight at Wilson's Creek and pledged loyalty to General Nathaniel Lyon. Later in the war, Home Guard groups would be dissolved and turned into formal militias. In addition, many regions in Missouri had strong pro-slavery communities who refused to support secession. This led to an extremely popular middle-of-the-road approach, which shows just how much border states adopted positions of compromise. For many of those who lived in border states, there were strong cultural ties to slavery in the Deep South, even as economic investments moved further and further to the north. Politically, these people are generally identified as conditional Unionists, people who did not support the abolition of slavery, but still supported the Union. William Edwards, who was not here at his home during the battle, was a pro-Union man, as was John Ray, another man who lived on the battlefield. Ray supported the Union and was employed by the federal government as a postmaster. He also owned multiple slaves. We can see clearly how not all Union supporters were anti-slavery, especially in border states. Despite the Union's anti-slavery stance by the end of the war, Ray continued to support the Union. His story is common for many Union supporters who also supported slavery or owned slaves themselves. Loyalty to the Union took precedence. Importantly, many of these loyalties shifted throughout the war. An 1883 Greene County history remarked that secessionists one week became Union men the next, and vice versa. Of course, not all slave owners supported the Union. Especially in rural areas and counties that bordered southern states, secessionists joined to fight against the Union and support the rebel cause. Especially during the early stages of the war, though, rebel loyalties were not always to the Confederate government itself. The different groups at Wilson's Creek helped to illustrate this point. First, there were official Confederate troops under the command of Brigadier General Benjamin McCulloch. These troops, mostly from Texas and Louisiana, were formally under the command of the Confederate military. Soldiers in these regiments generally pledged loyalty to the National Confederate government as the head of the army. In addition, there were Arkansas state troops, which had not formally folded into the Confederate military. These men would likely still define their loyalty to the state of Arkansas rather than the National Confederate government. Finally, and most interestingly, there were Missouri State Guardsmen. The Missouri State Guard is one of the most unique military organizations during the Civil War. It was created in May 1861 as a new version of the Missouri State Militia, under the command of former Missouri Governor Sterling Price. The majority of its officers and enlisted men supported secession, and it fought alongside the Confederate forces at Wilson's Creek. However, it was not officially a part of the Confederate Army. Instead, it was attached to the exiled Missouri Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson and his government in exile. These men pledged loyalty to the state government, despite the removal of Governor Jackson and other secessionist elements of the Missouri legislature. In this way, these men were not loyal to the actual Missouri government, but instead a secessionist version of it that was recognized by the Confederacy and not the Union. Kentucky would also end up with 2 different state governments during the war. All of these groups pose interesting questions as to what we mean by a Confederate or a rebel. At Wilson's Creek, a rebel soldier wasn't necessarily a Confederate and may have never lived in a Confederate state. The rebel troops at Wilson's Creek recognized the Confederate government and Brigadier General McCulloch as the head authorities, even though they didn't necessarily pledge their loyalty to the Confederacy. It isn't just historians who have difficulties determining what a true rebel was. During the battle, Franz Sigel mistakenly allowed Confederate troops from Louisiana to fire on his Union soldiers because he had mistaken them for Union soldiers from Iowa. This early in the war, there were not enforced standards for colors or dress codes among soldiers. The rebel Missouri State Guardsmen who rendered their loyalty to a citizens' militia rather than a national army were, for the most part, dressed in civilian clothes. Because of this, making quick determinations of who was a rebel or a Union soldier was especially difficult. Another great example of competing loyalties in Missouri includes the face-off between James Totten's Union Cannon Battery and the rebel Pulaski Cannon Battery. As James Totten led his Union men to fire on the cannons from Arkansas, we have to wonder whether or not he remembered helping train those very men before the war. In fact, before James Totten joined the Union Army, the Pulaski Battery had been named Totten's Light Battery after James's father, William. This is only one of many great examples of shifting loyalties at Wilson's Creek. The battle, in the end, would result in a Confederate victory and the death of Union General Nathaniel Lyon. The rebel army, though, did not press on their victory. Instead, they split according to their regional loyalties. The formal Confederate troops and Arkansas militiamen returned to Arkansas, while General Price and the Missouri State Guardsmen pushed further north into Missouri. However, they would be pursued by Kansas Senator James Lane, who led a group of former Jayhawks to continue their fight against pro-slavery Missourians. Meanwhile, some Missouri State Guardsmen would leave their post entirely to become guerrilla fighters, inaugurating years of guerrilla violence that would come to define the Civil War experience in Missouri. Ultimately, the Battle of Wilson's Creek and the events that precede and follow it all help to highlight how loyalties formed and evolved throughout the Civil War. In border states, allegiance was often drawn along regional and ideological lines and did not fit within clear narratives of what was meant by a rebel or a Yankee. This video took a look at competing loyalties in Missouri and in border states. Our next videos will look at the death of Union General Nathaniel Lyon, and then at the experience of enslaved women on the battlefield and in border states. I'm Brandon Neely with the Civil War Institute, and thank you for watching.